say, first of all, thanks to the ACELC for inviting me. I've been thinking about these things for a little while, but your invitation forced me to put them on paper, and I greatly appreciate that. Also wanted to say that I included the name of my father and mother in the bio because usually when I'm introduced somewhere they say, "Do you know George?" So wanted to put that up front. Yeah, I kind of know him. The title in the program is a little bit different from what's on the paper, and so I'm going to reread that. Cooperatio in externis, communicatio in sacris, useful or unionistic? For decades, repeated controversies revolving around the principle cooperatio in externis, communicatio in sacris have arisen in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Just during my own time in the ministerium, we have witnessed at least 3 of these. I learned there were more. There was the 1991 CTCR document, Inter-Christian Relationships, the 2001 Yankee Stadium prayer service, and more recently, the Synod's reconsideration of cooperative arrangements with the ELCA after its 2009 General Assembly. We've also seen in recent years federal, state, and municipal policies directly aimed at persecuting the church and her members. Read Jack Phillips. A response to these cultural upheavals proves more impactful when it's coordinated and organized. Can the principal distinction between cooperation and communion be useful in our current context? It is my aim to examine this question. I intend to do so first by an historical study of its origins, second, by tracing its history in the Synodical Conference, third, by reflecting on the lessons learned and applying them to the ongoing life of the church. 1, defining the terms. First thing to do when taking up any topic is to define the terms. A study of cooperatio in externis, communicatio in sacris requires us to define their meaning, but this is not as easily done as one might suppose. Their Latin form might lead us, and it did lead me, to assume an origin in canon law. But a scan of the principal documents of pre-Reformation Rome does not bear this out. Neither the whole Latin phrase, nor either half of it, appears in the Corpus Juris Canonici, nor in Gratian's Decretals, or any other pre-Reformation sources, as far as I can tell. As a fallback position, one might assume that both halves of the axiom were coined together, and this could provide a meaning to discovering their exact meaning. But neither is this borne out by the evidence. It seems that the phrase communicatio in sacris came first into use in the Roman Catholic circles around the mid-18th century, while the phrase cooperatio in externis arose in the early 20th century. So lacking either the assistance of ancient history or the ability to use one term to help define the other, we are left to define each term independently and then bring them together. Communicatio in sacris. The earliest use of this phrase that I could find was a 1752 writing from Pope Benedict XIV. He wrote, "Innumerable canons of the Church have renewed this prohibition, but most of all do they press hard lest Catholics should communicate with heretics in sacred things, or lest they should frequent the gatherings of the same," unquote. Later in the same document, he also uses the phrase communication in divinis with heretics. So while the words divinis and sacris are used interchangeably, both of them refer to the sharing of sacramental rites with heretics and schismatics. Down to our present day, Rome employs these terms to forbid receiving the sacraments of Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, matrimony, holy orders from any heretical priest, or to commune with known heretics, schismatics, or apostates. By the way, notice that baptism is missing from that list. That's because of Stephen of Rome. That's a whole nother story. Grammar confirms this meaning. Technically, communicatio is the opposite of excommunicatio, the exclusion from communion fellowship. And hence, communicatio in Sacris means communion or participation in the holy things. Students of Werner Ehlert should notice that this relates to the detailed discussion found in Eucharist and church fellowship in the first 4 centuries. There, participation in the holy things was plainly understood as sharing in the sacrament of the altar. You might recall the ta hagia hagiois, the holy things for the holy people. In Lutheran usage, at least since the 20th century, it is a technical term for church fellowship. For instance, in 1965 CTCR document, Theology of Fellowship, uses it as the simple equivalent of church fellowship and remarks that these terms are, quote, somewhat more inclusive than the expression altar and pulpit fellowship, unquote. And therefore, communicatio in Sacris refers specifically to the worship of the saints in the sacred assembly with the sacred liturgy, particularly participation in the sacraments. While communicatio in Sacris is traceable to the 18th century, cooperatio in externis has a much more recent origin. It cannot be found in the Lutheran dogmatic tradition. Albert Calver III reports, quote, the earliest reference we found to the term cooperatio in externis was located in a Roman Catholic work on moral theology, published in 1896. But there, it was used to name the cooperation between two people in perpetrating a sin. Cooperatio in externis, or cooperation in externals, may sound definitive, but it begs several questions. First, who are the entities cooperating? Are they church bodies, congregations, or individuals? Second, what exactly are the matters being deemed externals? Thirdly, to what are they external? To the church? To the gospel? To the word of God? The possibilities are endless. And without a clear definition, cooperation in externals can become a stretch to fit justification for all manner of unionism, and it has. George Lilligard delivered an essay to the 1949 convention of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod titled Ecumenism and Cooperation in Externals. His work deserves to be studied by all who are interested in the topic of this conference. His essay exposes inter-Lutheran unionism between 1913 and 1949, taking particular care to show how cooperation-type language was used to advance a unionistic agenda. Anybody familiar with that writing, Lilligard? Okay, so I won't be preaching to the choir. A unionistic understanding of cooperation in externals typically has 3 hallmarks. First, that cooperation in externals is placed on a sliding scale somewhere between full communion and no spiritual affinity whatever. So rather than considering cooperatio as a qualitatively different category than communicatio, they proceed as if the difference were a matter of degree, not kind. We're going to keep coming back to that. That's important. Witness, for example, Osborne Haugie's assessment of the Lutheran Bureau created in January 1918. The Bureau is of importance in the historical record because it represents the pioneer effort of American Lutherans to cooperate in the development of a practical program relating to the external functions of the Church. It not only played a fundamental role in rallying Lutheran forces behind the war effort, but constituted a notable attempt to achieve mutual understanding and to lay the foundation for still closer cooperation. Note the last three words, still closer cooperation. The idea expressed here is that the degree of cooperation would increase over time as more mutual understanding was achieved. So the sliding scale of cooperative activity pairs with a corresponding understanding of externals. They, externals, are not seen as external to church fellowship, as outside of communicatio in Sacris. Rather, they are judged relatively as further from or nearer to the center of the church's life. Dr. H.G. Stubb, the first president of the National Lutheran Council, told its executive board, "At this stage, we must be very careful not to give the impression that the council is to be the exponent or spokesman of a united church in matters of doctrine, but only an organization dealing with matters of a more external character. It is my earnest hope that the council may be a great help in bringing the different Lutheran church bodies together in a great American Lutheran church, but we must go slowly." Again, Hauge, this is Osborne Hauge, writes of the November 1919 meeting of the National Lutheran Council. So he's an outsider assessing the proceedings of the meeting. "All who were present manifested an eagerness for concord. A sense of urgency was lent to these deliberations by the generally accepted conviction that the council program would necessarily require some sort of cooperation involving more than res externa." The first citation from Stubb makes it clear that externals are not a set category, but a characteristic, which is sometimes more and sometimes less. The second citation from Hauge reveals that the cooperation is not limited to externals, but that some sorts of cooperation involve more than res externa. Second, this is the second hallmark of a unionistic use of it. Comparative language invoked in both degrees of cooperation and degrees of externality lead unionists then to set confessional or denominational boundaries for cooperative partners. A clear example of this is found in the Declaration of Principles Concerning the Church and its External Relationships, adopted by the United Lutheran Church in 1920. Notice the footnote, this was published in the CTM in 1935, without comment. Very interesting. To set the stage, note the language they used in declaring their desire for fellowship with all Lutherans. Quote, "We believe that those groups in which the word of God is most purely preached and confessed according to the Holy Scriptures, and in which the sacraments are administered in the closest conformity to the institution of Christ, will be the most complete expressions of the Holy Church." One Holy Church. The comparative language of most purely, closest conformity, most complete, as criterion for full fellowship, slides into another doctrinal test with lesser purity, lesser conformity, and lesser completeness. And so, under the subtitle concerning cooperative movements among the Protestant churches, these are non-Lutheran Protestants, the ULC proposed a 9-point doctrinal test, saying, quote, "We cannot enter into any cooperative movement or organization which denies any of the doctrines or principles set forth here. Such conditions make cooperation less dependent upon the task at hand and more a statement of doctrinal agreement." The third hallmark of the unionist view is that the program of cooperation is intended to advance church fellowship. Indeed, Lutheran men and women in America listed first among its aims and objects, quote, to encourage fellowship and cooperation in externals among Lutherans. Likewise, the Lutheran Society Incorporated resolved in its May 1947 convention, quote, that we express the hope that continued successful cooperation among Lutherans will lead to the solution of the problems of pulpit fellowship, communion administration, transfer of members, and that we prayerfully appeal to all Lutheran bodies to expand their efforts toward cooperation, which, God grant, may finally lead to the Lutheran Church which is truly united, unquote. Having laid out the way that many unionists have understood cooperation in externals, we must pause to inquire whether this is the authentic and original meaning of the term. Could it be rather a perversion and misuse of a pre-existing Orthodox phrase? So with this question in view, I re-examined Lilligard's essay, taking particular notice of the language of the Unionists themselves. To be sure, he found much talk of cooperation and frequent use of the word externals. But the phrase as a whole was used only one time by the Lutheran men and women in America. Footnote here frustrated me that I wasn't able to find the date of this, but just from the layout of the article, I'm surmising this to be in the mid-40s, probably 45 or 47. Marty, would you put this on your list to figure out? Anyway, that's just an opinion. But according to Albert Culver, the first official use of the phrase cooperation in externals was LCMS President John Benkin's 1941 address to the American Lutheran Conference. He said, Missouri has been cooperating in externals in matters which do not involve pulpit, altar, and prayer fellowship. Such cooperation must not be interpreted as a step toward fellowship or a method of bringing about fellowship among Lutherans, unquote. Notice two things. First, Benkin makes clear that in no way may cooperation in externals encroach on communicatio in Sacris. It refers only to those things that do not involve pulpit, altar, and prayer fellowship. Second, cooperation is not some method for bringing about fellowship among Lutherans. And in this way, he directly denies two of the three hallmarks we've laid out of the Unionist interpretation of cooperation in externals. Now, while Benkin's remark is the earliest use of the phrase that we've come across, nevertheless, its origin remains uncertain. Benkin, however, does demonstrate one thing. The Unionist interpretation is not the only game in town. There exists a proper and orthodox understanding of the idea as well. Lilligard also confirms this observation, substituting the English working together for its Latin equivalent, cooperation. He writes, there are, for example, questions concerning our relation to the state, where we may make common cause with other Protestants, or even with Catholics and Jews, without prejudice to our Lutheran confessions. It was obvious that in our work against the child labor amendment, we were not working together with Catholics because we felt that they were our brethren in the faith. We happened only to share the same position on a legislative measure which affected the work of the church, unquote. Notice, key to Lilligard's approval here is that the agreement among Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and Lutherans is limited to the position on a legislative measure and not upon any measure of doctrinal brotherhood. And this allows a working together on a particular common cause without prejudice to our Lutheran confessions. Correspondingly, Lilligard's criticism of externals rests on the confusion introduced by those who include elements of preaching and teaching. He writes, "There has been a great deal of confusion as to just what was meant by externals of church work. For some mean by that all the activities of the church in the mission fields, education, and charities, while others mean only such activities as do not involve the spiritual program of the church. That is, the preaching of the word, the care of souls, and the administration of the sacraments," unquote. This clearly implies that where externals are defined to exclude the spiritual program of the church, the term can be used rightly. For Lilligard, as for Benken before him, this meant the explicit exclusion, not only of altar and pulpit fellowship, but also of prayer fellowship from any cooperation. Clearly, both of these synodical conference theologians see an orthodox way to make common cause with other Christian denominations, even with non-Christian groups. In fact, Lilligard makes the potential inclusion of non-Christian groups a litmus test of true cooperation. He writes, "The test of so-called externals in church work is whether they may properly be carried on with all manner of churches and religious or civic organizations," unquote. Despite their clear agreement on the contours of joint work, Lilligard and Benken seem to disagree on the terminology. Benken unapologetically uses the term cooperation and externals as long as it is understood in an orthodox way. Lilligard, on the contrary, seems to regard it with suspicion and prefers to substitute the terms making common cause and working together. It's beyond the scope of this paper to explore how that divergence between Lilligard and Benken and between the ELS and the LCMS more generally played out. Suffice it to say that the Missouri Synod has continued using the term cooperation and externals in its orthodox sense from its first appearance in 1941 all the way to the present. The language appears in a 1944 resolution of the Saginaw Convention. Declining to join the National Lutheran Council, the convention said, "This would apparently involve our synod in unionistic principles and endeavors beyond a mere cooperation in externals," unquote. Again, the implication is clear. The cooperation in itself is orthodox. Unionism goes beyond mere cooperation. Later, the 1965 CTCR document, Theology of Fellowship, reaffirms this language. Among 6 guidelines that come near the end of the document, it stipulates, quote, "Where the faith and confession of the church are not compromised, and the word of God and conscience will allow, various denominations should cooperate, or at least not work at cross purposes," unquote. This CTCR report was officially adopted by the Synod by Resolution 2-13 of the 1967 Convention in New York. Again, in 1974, the CTCR report, "A Lutheran Stance Towards Ecumenism," also defined Orthodox cooperation as excluding communicatio in Sacris. It states, "In relation to other church bodies and agencies, the Synod will gladly cooperate in externals, that is, participate in projects which do not involve joint worship or the spiritual ministry of the church," unquote. Within the last decade, ELCA's 2009 decision to approve the blessing of same-sex marriage prompted the LCMS to reconsider cooperative arrangements. A special task force was created to report on theological implications of the 2009 ELCA decisions. This report, delivered to the 2010 convention and commended for study and reference, reasserted the qualitative difference between altar and pulpit fellowship and cooperation in externals. Quote, "It has been the long-standing practice of confessional Lutheran churches to distinguish between joint participation by churches and church workers in word and sacrament ministry, altar and pulpit fellowship, or communicatio in Sacris, Communio in Sacris, and cooperation between churches in matters of physical need, cooperatio in externis," unquote. The 2010 Synodical Convention then directed the CTCR to develop more in-depth theological criteria for assessing cooperative endeavors. By December of that year, the CTCR produced principles for cooperation in externals with theological integrity for sharing with the Praesidium. Principles reiterated and endorsed the 1941 view of Benken, the 1944 Saginaw Convention, the 1965 Theology of Fellowship, the 1974 Lutheran Stance Towards Ecumenism. You'll make that correction. I think you've got a typo there, lapse in my memory. And the 2010 Theological Implications. I quote from the Principles. In Theological Implications, the Synod has again reaffirmed a long-standing and important distinction between cooperation in externals and communion in sacred things. Rather than viewing cooperative work with other churches as a first step toward altar and pulpit fellowship, or as necessitating full doctrinal agreement, the Church seeks to maintain the clear distinction between the two concepts, so that the cooperation in externals does not imply communion in sacred things in any way. It continues a little further down the page. Cooperative efforts are always toward goals, and only the Word of God and the Christian conscience can determine those goals. In individual life, this is the case. The Christian person can cooperate with his neighbor in many things, but not in sin, not in the denial of the gospel, not in anything that is contrary to God's word or a conscience shaped by scriptures. In summary, Synod has endorsed the concept of cooperation in externals, by which we mean the possibility of working with Christians with whom we are not in church fellowship. Cooperation in externals requires a common goal or an agreed purpose which is consistent and consonant with the objectives, doctrine, and practice of the Synod. No external cooperative work may in any way compromise or imply a disagreement with the Synod's teaching and practice, and therefore may not contradict Holy Scripture or the scripturally formed Christian conscience, unquote. Like a bad penny, though, the unionistic understanding of cooperation still crops up from time to time. Perhaps the most serious of these was the 1991 CTCR document, Inter-Christian Relationships. It was permeated with the language that set cooperation on a kind of a sliding scale with communion. It wasn't only the Northern Illinois district, but many circuits and districts and individual pastors objected loudly. I'm looking at a fellow member of my circuit from those years, and we wrote something as a circuit, as I recall. Professor Kurt Marquardt even took the extraordinary step, this is the first time ever done, the extraordinary step of publishing a minority report of the CTCR in the Concordia Theological Quarterly. In the end, Inter-Christian Relationships failed in its bid to reintroduce the unionistic interpretation of cooperation. Missouri's orthodox understanding of cooperation has prevailed through nearly 8 decades. We have seen that cooperation in externals is a Johnny-come-lately to the domain of theological terms. Communicatio in Sacris predates it by at least 2 centuries, and the concept of communion has an unbroken tradition all the way back to the day when Cain was excommunicated from the Church of Adam. This fact raises a question. How did the church ever get along without cooperation and externals? I answer, she didn't. Rather, the term, which developed in the early 20th century, merely gave a name to what the church has always known. Namely, whatever is not communicatio in sacris falls into the all-embracing category of a Christian's life in the world. Were cooperatio in externis to mean anything other than this, then its sudden appearance in the early 20th century could only be interpreted as introducing a novel doctrine unknown to the church. And novelty is always false. Through the entire history of the church, there were only these 2 categories with no middle ground between them. The ecumenical movement attempted to introduce a tertium quid, somewhere between communion and a Christian's life in the world. And this it did by blurring the line between communicatio in sacris and everything else, and then, step 2, treating this fuzzy zone as though it were a category in its own right. Now, one tempting response to this blurring of the line is to steer clear of it altogether. After all, if the line itself has become so fuzzy that it covers unionistic territory, it makes good sense to avoid all of it. But such a response avoids unionism at the expense of the truth. It tacitly concedes to the unionist the existence of this new false category. The antidote is not to treat the fuzzy zone with caution, but to deny its legitimacy. This requires a renewed focus to see the line as it truly is. The distinction between church fellowship and every other Christian activity is qualitative, not quantitative. It is a distinction of kind and not degree. Considerations of degree should never be substituted for considerations in kind. Such substitutions have always been the first hallmark of the unionistic era. They occur both when cooperation is considered on a sliding scale and when externals are seen as closer to or farther from the church's life and doctrine. Either way, the categorical distinction between cooperation and externals and communicatio in sacris is denied. And therefore, where unionists allege a blurry and broad line, we maintain a clear and narrow line. Even prior to defining the line, we must confess both its existence and its nature, that it is both razor thin and crystal clear. And this confession alone is a strong bulwark against unionism. But to make this confession, boldness is required. We must be bold to act in every area of Christian love, while simultaneously being bold to reject every temptation to compromise faith. These two are not mutually exclusive, as we often hear all the time. They are not mutually exclusive, rather they are complementary. By rejecting every form of unionism, we proclaim an unmitigated love. And by embracing every opportunity to love, we proclaim an uncompromising faith. Timidity is the tool of Satan. He uses it both to frighten God's people into unionistic arrangements as well as to frighten God's people away from bold love of the pagan neighbor. Both of these avenues obscure the doctrinal clarity between unionism and the church's life in this world, and the Christian's life in this world. Let us fight Satan's timidity with the boldness of Christ's clear word. You, my brothers and sisters, have long known that unionism, under the excuse that one is, quote, erring on the side of the gospel, erring on the side of love, is both intellectually lazy and at the same time pharisaical. You see that communicatio, where fellowship does not exist, is never love, but actually harms the neighbor by giving them a false confession. Let us today notice with equal clarity that efforts to avoid unionism by reluctance to, quote, get too close to unionism is likewise intellectually lazy and similarly pharisaical. There is no closer or further in the realm of communicatio in Sacris. There's simply right or wrong. And to act otherwise, as St. Paul did in Antioch, gives a false confession just as surely as unionism gives a false confession. But how shall we know the boundary so that we can move freely and confidently in either realm? This certainty comes precisely from knowing that the difference between communion and cooperation is a difference of kind and not degree. With this doctrine, we are equipped to live fully the Christian life of love without ever compromising the confession of our faith. When a confession of faith is required, no compromising whatsoever is possible. When love is required, a Christian will risk everything to serve the neighbor. The nature of communion versus cooperation can be stated as a simple litmus test. Wherever communion is in play, our entire focus is on the confession of the parties involved. Wherever cooperation is in play, we care nothing about the confession of the counterparts involved in the cooperation. We only care whether joint action is needed for this love. For example, in joint worship, even the most orthodox action becomes a sin when unequally yoked. You could have the perfect page 15 Mass, but if you're standing next to an Elko Lutheran, it's sin. But on the other hand, when joining hands is necessary to rescue somebody who's fallen through the ice, it would be a sin not to grab the hand of the Muslim or the Buddhist or the even, it's hard to say, even the Elko Lutheran standing next to you. Church fellowship is one kind of thing. The Christian's life in the world is another kind of thing. And even when they're drawn together in the closest proximity, one cannot mistake one for the other. We see this every Sunday. You see it in your churches. When non-LCMS visitors are present at worship, they stand up, they sit down, they speak with us, they listen with us, but the communion makes the difference and manifests what's true. And thus, communication in Sacris has a very definite meaning and doesn't mean everything. Admission to the altar, sharing of pulpits, serial prayers, to quote Bowman, I guess that was from, joint worship are all sharp and clear lines which must not be crossed. No Orthodox Lutheran can engage in these things with those who are not in church fellowship. But beyond such prohibitions, we are not permitted to set up additional boundaries. We may not create buffer zones without falling in with the Unionists and creating that tertium quid, that fuzzy zone which becomes its own thing. This brings us to consider the second hallmark of unionism, namely when cooperation, joint work, is conditioned by confessional statements. On this point, I think Lilligard was spot on. He articulated the litmus test for sniffing out false kinds of cooperation and externals, saying, quote, "If the matter at issue is actually an external, which does not involve the confession of the church or its spiritual program, then there could be no objection to joining in with Catholics, Jews, Masons, or any other organization that might happen to be concerned," unquote. In January 2012, when President Harrison testified jointly with a Baptist, a Catholic, and a Jew, sounds like the beginning of a joke, he was employing Lilligard's litmus test precisely. The same is true of every true cooperative endeavor, be it the March for Life, an amicus brief, or an appearance before a state legislative committee. Willingness to work with some and not others, based on confessional or denominational considerations, is a sure sign that it's not truly external to church fellowship, but integral to it. That being said, a word of clarification is in order here. There may well arise considerations which make it impossible to cooperate with someone on a specific task, but this eo ipso does not mean that the task has failed the litmus test. Key here is the reason for the impediment. A couple of examples may suffice. For instance, we may find it impossible to work with Jews in feeding the poor because of their false kosher laws. That doesn't mean that it's their false confession itself which is prohibited. The very fact that they have a false confession, that's not prohibitive. It only means that this particular false doctrine creates conditions where work with a different group that didn't have to worry about kosher may be more efficient towards the goal. Similarly, and more close to home, now that the ELCA fully condones same-sex marriages, quote, and is willing to place children up for adoption into same-sex households, we are prohibited from working with them in adoption services. But this prohibition is not due to the fact that there is a doctrinal disagreement to us. It is rather because we simply cannot agree on the very task that should be jointly done, namely where to place the kids. Finally, let's take up the third hallmark of unionistic cooperation, that its goal is to forge a union through cooperative endeavors. An orthodox approach to cooperation neither intends nor implies unity on anything other than the desirability of the task at hand. This false view of cooperation hardly arises when Christians are acting in their personal capacity. A Christian citizen signing the same petition with his Jewish neighbor can in no way be construed as a unionistic act, nor can a mutual conversation over the back fence about the Bible be mistaken for pulpit fellowship, or a Thanksgiving dinner be interpreted as table fellowship. And all the same observations are equally true of a pastor acting in his personal capacity. There is, however, the additional fact that by virtue of his office as a called and ordained servant of the word, others may well project meaning into the pastor's actions that they don't project, for instance, into the same actions performed by an elder or a Sunday school teacher. And so there is both an objective nature of his actions as well as a subjective and quite varied interpretation of his actions. And these are complications that each pastor has to wrestle with as he seeks faithfully to carry out his multiple offices of father, pastor, citizen, and so forth. We'll talk more about that this afternoon. But what's particularly bedevils cooperation in externals are those times when church bodies, considering joint work on some project of love. Indeed, it is this problem that precipitates some of the most troubling arrangements. Military chaplaincy, Lutheran adoption services, Lutheran social services, and the like have occasioned any number of unionistic events. Whether such unionism was caused by the cooperation itself or by the weakness of those involved in the cooperation is another matter. I frankly don't know, and there's so many examples, we'd have to take each one up individually. But whatever the case, I hope that these principles laid out above will serve to clarify the issues and give us an objective way of dealing with these serious concerns. In addition to actional unionism, there are a slew of other doctrinal problems that have arisen out of cooperative arrangements. When Lutheran Family Services first began operating, who could have foreseen that one of the partner organizations would suddenly overturn the very notion of the family itself, namely the ACELC adopting the homosexual agenda? Or when Lutheran Social Services began, who could have foreseen that one of the organizations would ever publicly teach that abortion should be considered a service? As the ELCA has lurched ever further from Lutheranism, not to mention Christianity, Missouri has found that the legal and financial relationships take longer to disentangle than these social shifts require. If we've learned anything from these realities, it is that the permanent cooperative arrangements can have serious unforeseen consequences. Unionistic perceptions remain one of the greatest difficulties in working out the true Christian principles of cooperation with pagans and Christians alike. Because no matter how clear we may be in our own minds that our joint work neither expresses nor implies confessional agreement, others may think likewise. Whether it be the cooperative partner thinking likewise, outside observers, or people within our own synod who misconstrue the intentions, we will never have absolute control about what others think. There's a huge irony here. Think this through. When the cooperation itself is perfectly biblical, misperceptions arise precisely because those who are misperceiving have a false or confused understanding of church fellowship. And so we're faced with an impossible choice. Either we have to successfully correct their false doctrine of fellowship before we can cooperate, or we must bear with their misunderstandings and false doctrines and cooperate the best we can. But if we insist on full agreement in doctrine of church fellowship before cooperation is possible, we fall again into the categorical error. We're no longer talking about cooperation in externals, but communion and sacris, because it matters about the confession first. And hence, to insist that every party to the cooperation and every onlooker first agree on some point of Lutheran doctrine would give a false confession of the nature of cooperation, which depends only upon the agreement of the point of cooperation. That's the irony. What's a church to do? It might be helpful to recognize the situation for what it is, because we see it every day between people. Why should we not expect it to arise between groups? It's like a boy and a girl working together on a chemistry project. Either party may project romantic assumptions into the project that are not in the mind of the other. When those awkward falsehoods are articulated, corrective words should be spoken and the assignment completed if possible. Satan is the source of this confusion. He is quite adept at sowing it to disrupt many a good deed. An innocent touch to comfort a grieving person could be mistaken for an opening to adultery or worse. This calls for prudence and care, but not for withdrawal. For the same reason, we must be clear in our own minds and true to our own doctrine, undeterred by the malicious slander of the enemy. As I noted above, there are special difficulties whenever church bodies, and not merely Christians and pastors, wade into the public square. For this reason, congregations and synods should exercise special caution before rushing in. First, a church body should understand clearly why it, and not just its membership, is entering into the fray. Second, a church organization should cooperate in externals only where it is a necessary ingredient to loving one's neighbor. Now, every congregation, every synod, denomination has an address on some particular street. They receive postal service. They're hooked up to city water and sewer. They file an annual corporation statement with the state. They're subject to zoning laws and public accommodation laws and a whole array of connections in the public square. And these connections are shared equally by all kinds of religious organizations of every stripe and denomination. To the extent that we are related to the temporal government in these ways, and to the extent that cooperation with other organizations so situated share our concerns and needs, it is an act of love for our members and other citizens to cooperate in protecting the interests of ecclesiastical organizations. But if and when we do, we must be absolutely clear that we are not acting as church per se, but as ecclesiastical organizations with a specific relation to the government and a shared interest with other such organizations. This is not at all the same thing as communing in sacred things. Again, the boundary lines are sharp and clear. We must observe them with equally sharp and clear understanding of the responsibilities that God gives us as congregations and synods to participate in the governance of things that pertain to our abilities to serve our membership, our neighbors, and our progeny. To this end, may God give us understanding and grace. Amen.